You know what this is? You know what this is? Some people do. I want to take a poll. See how many get it. It's a spring. If you know me, you know I'm a car guy, so you probably know that this is a valve spring. How much can I tell you about a valve spring in less than 5 minutes? All right, let's try it. Valve spring is typically in the cylinder heads. Let's just say it's in the cylinder heads. If you know what a cylinder heads is, you know what I'm talking about. If you know what cylinder heads are, then you know what I'm talking about. And it could be 24 of these. If you've ever heard of a 24 valve engine, then each valve would have a spring to go along with it. The spring is responsible for closing the valve and keeping it closed. If it fails in that duty, any kind of way, then it can cause the efficiency of the engine to begin to diminish, depending on how poor performance the spring is. Depending on how poor the spring performance are. There's different types of springs. This one right here is a cylindrical, given a name for the shape of a cylinder. There's beehives where it curves from top to bottom. There's conical that looks like a cone and is skinnier at the top and it's wider at the bottom. So in other words, right here will be skinnier. So in other words, if this was the top, this would be a little bit skinnier, and then it'll go down like a cone. Can it spin on the engine? If you take the valve cover off, you can see the top of the spring sort of like this. And then out of the center, you'll see a valve sticking out. Now, when the engine is running, it could spin like this. And some engines have what they call a valve rotator on top of it. Anytime metal and metal has to rub across each other or rub against each other, there has to be some type of friction reducing component. It could be a bearing or it can be some type of bushing of some sort. A rotator is pretty much a bearing, so it can just rotate. Everything affects each other. The energy that's produced in the springs could transfer itself into the rotation of the bearing. So I want you to think about that when you start thinking about how could that malfunction. Because as a technician, it's important to understand how a component could malfunction. If you understand why a component malfunction or how it could malfunction, when you get those hard, when you get those difficult vehicles that's giving you troubles in trying to figure out the main problem of a situation, just knowing how something could malfunction, first knowing how it works. If you know how it works, then you can understand how it can malfunction. And if you have that in your mindset, then when you need to do some critical thinking and start thinking outside the box, you can picture how things works in your mind, and you can pan out what can go wrong. So in my class, I normally have my students, before I tell them all the things that can go wrong, I have them just give me some theories. And I'll write it on the board. We'll create a list. And they might say some stuff like, well, it's a spring and it's supposed to have tension, but maybe it can lose tension. Maybe the heat from the engine could make it weaker. It can break. All of this is true. The spring itself, like a slinky, it can become weak to the point where now it stays like this, or it's wider, or it can stretch. In other words, it can shrink or it can stretch. It can lose its tensile strength. The tensile strength is how much pressure, when you squeeze it. How hard is it? How difficult is it to squeeze it? Pretty much. But not only what could go wrong, that's just the beginning. What can cause it to go wrong? You have to understand the cause and effect theory. Something happened, but something happened because something else happened. It's the way that the world works. Everything, some kind of way, affects something. So what makes it get hot? You could probably say just the temperature of the engine just gets hot. But it doesn't work like that, because the engine works at, let's just say, a 200 degrees standard. Well, the spring is, it can conduct 200 degrees. They make these to be able to withstand something, because you got to think about how long does these cars last. These cars last quite a while. So everything that's in those cars, everything in these cars need to perform at a high efficiency. If one thing fails, then the car doesn't last that long. So 200 degrees is really going to hurt the spring. Not unless the spring was made as a faulty spring from the manufacturer. If this spring is supposed to withstand certain heat, and the way it works is, if you ever watch how things are made, you will see how metal goes through some type of refinery. It melts it down and it does some things. These springs are cast iron, thin cast iron with flexibility. And the way you structure certain metal depends on the you sacrifice the hardness for the flexibility. And it has to have a little bit of both. So if the hardness if the spring wasn't structured enough where it can withstand certain temperature, that's another property. How well is it able to withstand it? Meaning, how able will it take temperature and dissipate it? Anything that can take temperature and dissipate it, meaning that if it gets hot, it lets go of hot. Meaning that you touch the stove and you take your hand off the stove so your hand doesn't get burnt up worse than it already has. Then it will be weak and it could break. What about other problems? What about how could other components? Let's think about surrounding components. What about the valve? The valve seat is supposed to sit tightly, and you get combustion gases that can leak past the valve and up into the spring area, and that could cause the spring to heat up hotter than normal.